to say that we are going to look at the fascinating Parsha of Beha'alotecha. That is not a surprise, unless you are visiting us from Israel, in which case you may be scratching your head because you already did that one last week. But in Chutz La'aretz, we are doing it this coming Shabbos, Parshas Beha'alotecha. So I hope you have a Chumash, because it's always useful to have the text with you, especially because ha-Hayyim frequently has close attention to the nuances of the language, and therefore to have the psukim before you is very illuminating, and if you excuse the pun. So we'll begin actually at the beginning of the Parsha, which is Beha'alotecha, as we said. So it's the beginning of chapter 8 of Bamidbar, whichever chumash that you may have. Choose the one that suits you best. So this Parsha is known as Beha'alotecha, as we mentioned. The word Beha'alotecha is usually translated when you kindle the lights, because it says, Daber Aharon, speak to Aharon v'amarta elav, and say to him, Beha'alotecha es haneros, when you kindle the lights, El mupnei hamenorah ya'iru shivas haneros, the 7 lights shall be kindled or shall illuminate. Can you hear me? Sorry. Okay, the 7 lights, the 3 shafts on each side, 6 altogether, shall point inwards towards the central shaft. That's called the Ner, according to many, that's called the Ner ha-Ma'aravi. Now, the reason I'm drawing close attention to the word Beha'alotecha is that it actually is an unusual word, because the meaning or the root of the word Beha'alotecha is when you cause to ascend. The word, the shoresh, the root of the word is al, like la'alot, to ascend, even el al, the airline. Al means upon. Beha'alotecha means when you cause to ascend, when you cause the flame to ascend, or so it's usually understood. As we shall see, though, according to ha-Hayyim, the meaning and the choice of word is very clear, and I think it's a keen insight. But he starts with a much more problematic, the more basic question, which is the question that is prompted by Rashi's comments. So last week, I hope you remember the end of last week's Parsha, a very extended, actually repetitive sequence of verses that extended over nearly half of the Torah reading last week, which is the longest Torah reading in the Chumash, by the way. The repetition again and again of the offerings of the Nesiim. And this drama, this pageantry must have made a great impression on all who were watching, as the princes of each of the 12 tribes brought their very substantial offerings. They evidently coordinated it. They each brought the same. So that was wonderful. But it seems, according to Rashi, that Aharon was feeling left out. He was glum. Rashi says, Lama nisbecha parshas hamenorah la parshas haNesiim. Why is this short chapter, Parsha, this chapter, this paragraph about Aharon lighting the menorah, why is it juxtaposed to that of the princes and their offerings? Lefishik shara Aharon chanukas haNesiim, because when Aharon saw the pageantry and the excitement surrounding the inauguration of the Mishkan through the hand of the princes of each of the tribes, chalsha da'ato, he became depressed, he became glum and down beat. He was very despondent. Neither he, Aharon, nor his tribe of Levi were involved. So he was feeling very down. So Hashem said to Moshe, you know what? You've got to cheer up your brother, and I've got good news for him. Tell him that he has a wonderful mitzvah, a wonderful role, very important role. Your position is greater than theirs. Shata, Rashi says, Madlik umeitivas haneros, because you light and you service the lights of the menorah. So don't be despondent. Now Ramban asks a number of questions on this comment of Rashi based on the Medrash, and ha-Hayyim asks some of the same questions without even mentioning Ramban, but essentially he's asking what Ramban asks. I mean, it's very hard to understand. Was Aharon so like craving the limelight, that he was feeling bad that his shevet, his tribe of Levi, was not represented? Says ha-Hayyim, Aharon was the central figure, besides being the central figure generally in the functioning of the Mishkan, as is very well known. It was also his role to actually offer the sacrifices and the offerings brought by the Nasim. Even in the previous 12 days, the princes of each tribe brought their offering, but they only brought it to the entrance of the Mishkan. Aharon, as the Kohen, was the one who actually offered those various sacrifices that were presented by the Nasim. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'dvaro. So it's hard to understand why he was feeling down in the first place. Besides which, the menorah, as again Ramban asks, was only one of the roles of the Kohen, especially the Kohen Gadol. He was the central figure. He brought the sacrifices, he brought the incense, he brought the wine libations and the nisuch ha-Hayyim, the meal offerings, and he had a portion in many of those as well. Whatever was happening, he was the central figure. Why did Hashem find it appropriate or effective even to console him by saying, you've got the menorah, don't forget, don't feel bad, don't be despondent, don't feel neglected, don't feel left out. You also have an important role, you've got the menorah. The menorah? What's so special about the menorah? Okay, Ramban answers it in his own way, but our shiur tonight is not on Ramban, it's on Or HaChaim, who has a very different approach. I think it's very clever. Says Or ha-Hayyim. If you look closely, the language that Rashi uses, quoting the Medrash, is Sha'ata madlik umeitivus haneros erev avoker, because you every evening and every morning you service the lights. Says the Or ha-Hayyim that we find a machlokes in Masechta Munachos about whether the lamps, whether the cups in which the oil was placed, in which the wicks were positioned, and which actually, of course, provided the illumination for this menorah, whether they were removable or whether they were of a single part with the rest of the menorah. That is to say, the menorah itself was fashioned out of one ingot of gold, that the Torah says very clearly. But what about the actual cups in which the oil was poured and where the wicks were positioned? Were those detachable? So there's a machlokes in the Gemara about whether they were detachable or not. Says Or ha-Hayyim, if I were there, he says, I would have proved they definitely are detachable. He adduces some sources for that. He says, we find, for example, at the end of Bamidbar, the illuminating candelabrum, and its lamps, or its cups, really, and its tongues, etc. So it says, Or ha-Hayyim, from there you see they were separate because the Torah mentions the illuminating menorah, the candelabrum itself, and then separately mentions neroseha, its lights, that is to say, the cups in which the oil was actually collected or placed. At any rate, it's true it's a machlokes, but what Or ha-Hayyim has to say fits in much better according to the view that they were taken out. He quotes the following, which, having never properly studied Masechta Menachos, was a very difficult tractate. I hadn't been aware, or maybe if I had, I'm afraid I forgot. He says the following. He says that Misalkan, they would remove the cups in which the oil was actually held, umenichan ba'ohel, and place them in the tent of meeting, that is to say, in the Mishkan, umekancham, they would wipe them, besfug, with a sponge, v'nosein behem shemen, and put the oil in them. That is to say, the hatavas, the servicing, was an important part of what Aharon did, and that was an essential part of what comforted him. Why? Because if they were removed and cleaned, and then oil was added to them, and then put back into the candelabrum every day, every morning, because they would burn at night, and in the morning he would service them. If that's the case, then he would effectively be inaugurating the Mishkan every day. So he was upset. Of course, he had a role that he knew, but what about the pageantry? What about the remarkable opportunity to be there at the beginning when the Mishkan is first inaugurated? The Nesiim did it day by day. Aaron says, but after that, it's all done. I'm just maintaining it. I'm just doing the same thing day by day. And I didn't have a chance to be there at the beginning to make a contribution to the actual inauguration. Says ha-Hayyim, that's what comforted him, because not just you light the menorah, you also service it. And when you do that, you take out the cups, you clean them with a sponge, and you add new oil, you put them back. And when you put them back, it's as if you are, so to speak, assembling the Mishkan once more. And you do that every day. You and your descendants will do it every day that the Mishkan functions. Even in the Beis Hamikdash, the same thing. So according to this, we understand very well why he was comforted with this, and why Hashem told Moshe to tell Aaron, you've got a very great role, greater than the Nesiim, because you actually have the opportunity to renew the functionality of the Mishkan day by day, because you take off the cups of the oil and you put them back. And with that, we can understand so beautifully why it says Beha'alotecha saneros. According to ha-Hayyim, it doesn't mean when you when you kindle the flame. What it means is when you place the cups in the correct position and you direct the wicks in such a manner that the three branches, the three arms on each side, all inclined towards the central shaft. That is part of the role of the Kohen, and that's part of the responsibility. It says in Pasuk base, it says that the Torah, that Aaron is instructed, when you place the cups in the correct position, you will do so that the wicks, each of the three wicks, as I say, on each side, will point towards the central shaft. This is how ha-Hayyim explains it. And with this, I would just like to add, we see a new appreciation and a new insight into that minhag, which I hope that you do, because we once mentioned it in the Working on Shabbos campaign, for those who are fortunate to have someone in their household to light the candles every Erev Shabbos. So as is very well known, that is the province of the woman. But the Ari mentions a minhag which many like to uphold, and that the husband also has a role. He prepares the candles, he readies them, and he prepares the wicks or the oil or the candles themselves for his wife to light every Friday. So this gives us a deeper insight, because it was that role, not only the lighting, but the servicing of the menorah, which was the great source of consolation to Aharon. And that's what Hashem said to Aharon, you've got Shilchai Gedolim Shalem, you've got something even greater. So I'd just like to remind the men, in case you've been neglecting that, it's an important thing to do. Also shows your wife how much you appreciate her, how much you love her, how much you value her, and it makes her feel special when she approaches the candles every Friday afternoon, Erev Yom Tov as well, to light them. Personally, for those who remember our Working on Shabbos campaign, I like to do that Motzei Shabbos. When I come home from shul, or nowadays, I'm already home, and as soon as I finish Mariv, before Havdalah, or actually right after Havdalah, I should say, right after Havdalah, I prepare the candles for Ruthie for the following Erev Shabbos. I'm not trying to laud myself. It's just one of the fairly limited things which I do, Lekavod Shabbos. And from here, now that I've learned this ha-Hayyim, I have a much better appreciation of the beauty and the importance of that part of the mitzvah of lighting the candles, or in the case of Aharon, it was actually, as we say, the menorah itself in the Mishkan. But the servicing of the candles, that was the greatness, because that allowed for the renewal day by day every morning. Okay, let's continue now with one of the most fascinating short passages in the Torah. What's fascinating about it, look in your Chumash in chapter 10, verses 35 and 36, especially verse 35. I'm going to turn there myself, because we will see when we get there a unique feature, which you probably are aware of, but if not, this is your chance to contemplate it. If you're looking at chapter 10, verse 35, then you'll see that those two short, familiar psukim are offset by an orthographical feature which is unique in the Torah. I'm referring to these inverted letters nun. They're upside down and backwards as well. And those are the letters nun, which according to the Masoretic tradition are added by the Sofer in the Sefer Torah. And if you have an opportunity to view a Sefer Torah, you will see that the Sofer has written those letters nun in a very deliberate fashion, just in the position that you may see it printed in your Chumash. Within the gap of those, within the gap between the verses, those letters nun appear in verse. Now the truth is, ha-Hayyim does not mention those letters nun. I thought he might, but he does not mention it. We'll talk about those nuns maybe on another occasion. But I'm just drawing attention to them because what he has to say about these two psukim is fascinating. And again, without highlighting those letters nun, it's as if he's saying that he's going to explain what is so significant about those psukim. Now, they are familiar to us because we say those same words when we take the Sefer Torah out on Shabbos, Yom Tov, and actually during the week as well. Whenever we take out the Sefer Torah in the context of the communal tefillah, we say those psukim. Vahi ben Soah Haaron, Vayom Moshe, Kuma Hashem vayafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. When the ark would travel, Moshe would say, Kuma Hashem, arise, God, v'yafutzu oivecha, may your foes be scattered, let those who hate you flee from before you. And when arrested, he would say, reside among the faithful of Israel. Okay, among the numerous 22,000 of Israel. Okay, but it's really the first of these two verses that interests us. So for one thing, the word Vayihi, or ha-Hayyim, consistently draws attention to it. The Talmud in Masechta Megillah says that the word Vayihi presages misfortune. It's like Vai, Oy Vei, Vai, Vayihi. Because often the Torah can say Vehaya. Haya, Vehaya suggests joy. Vayihi suggests sadness, grief, pain, misfortune. And we have a number of cases. The most famous example of this, I hope you know, is Vayihi Bimei Achashverosh. We also had it just a few weeks ago when we read the book of Ruth. Vayihi Bimei Shvot HaShoftim. So the Talmud says, what's the significance of Vayihi? And the Talmud suggests Vayihi is always bad news. Later on, the Talmud modifies and says only Vayihi Bimei is misfortune, because sometimes it says Vayihi and it's actually doesn't seem to be anything bad at all. But ha-Hayyim always looks for the drash. When it says Vayihi, where is the pain? Where is the misfortune? Even in Vayihi, like we have it right here. So he says, Vahi bin Saharon, when the ark would travel, Moshe would say, arise Hashem v'futzu oivecha. So there's a reference to the enemies, there's a reference to those who hate you, your foes. But we don't see what's so bad about that. I mean, it may be bad for the foes and for the enemies because Moshe is calling on God to scatter them, to disperse them. Of course, Hashem has the power to do that. And as we know, when the Jewish people traveled in the wilderness, they were protected not only from foes, but even from snakes, scorpions, and from heat and everything else. So on the surface, we don't see what's sort of ominous about that. Says ha-Hayyim, a profound insight, which he reminds us that he has told us about a few times before as well. I'll just read you. He says, we have to understand why the Torah draws attention to this, as I'm suggesting by those inverted letters nun. He says, in accordance with the teachings of the Kabbalistic tradition, I think he's quoting here Eitz Chaim, which is the writings of the Ari. We've mentioned it in a few places, that the reason the Jewish people were wandering in the desert, and although he doesn't say so here explicitly, elsewhere he says the reason for the phenomenon of the exile itself, because the peregrinations in the wilderness, the wanderings of the Jewish people for 40 years in the Sinai Peninsula, foreshadow and symbolize metaphorically the wanderings of the Jewish people throughout this exile of the last 2,000 years and more, because the exile preceded our present exile. Says Or ha-Hayyim, the reason is in order to collect and to redeem the sparks of holiness. This is the famous concept of birur nitzotzos, to sort, to sift, to extract, to reveal, to redeem, to liberate the sparks of holiness, nitzotzos hakadusha, which are trapped in the desert. Symbolically, the desert is a place of fearsomeness. It's a place of desolation. It's a place of where life can barely eke out an existence. So symbolically, wandering in the desert is seen as entering a very inhospitable, I've got an echo here, a very ominous place, a place that symbolically is in the clutches of the Sitra Achra, of the other side, that is to say, the forces of evil. Says Or ha-Hayyim that that's why they were in the wilderness, and that is a very difficult task to achieve. And by the way, as I mentioned, he says that's why we are in exile. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but that is part of the function of the purpose of our being in exile, is to redeem and liberate the nitzotzos hakadusha that exist wherever we may be, even in Golders Green, may I say. Even in Indiana, West Lafayette, Indiana, where I derive from. So says Or ha-Hayyim, there are two types. There are two types of chitzonim. Chitzonim means like the husk, the outer shell, what's called the klipa. It's also like a synonym for the forces of evil. He says there are two types, and I found this fascinating. I hope you will as well. He says that there are two categories. One is the mesit umefatel nidbak bo lahara ulahashchit. One is the force that seeks to lure and to seduce and to tempt and to lead astray the person. And the spark of holiness is surrounded, is trapped within that klipa, within that husk. And he wants a person, and the force, the effect of that negative influence is to lead a person astray, to succumb to his baser instinct of arrogance, of selfishness, of avarice, of greed, of personal aggrandizement, of succumbing to the physical urges that are part of the human condition. That is the objective of the Yetz, what we would call the Yetzer Hara. But there's another type. He says the other type is the Mazik u'Mechabel, which harms and devastates. That is to say, what we might call the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death. They're two sides of the same coin. They're two forces of evil. One that seeks to lead a person astray and lead to his spiritual downfall. The other that seeks to harm him in other ways, financially, bring him stress, bring him misery, bring him suffering, bring him lo aleinu, medical crises. The second type, it's not his nature to lure and to seduce. So he says, v'yafutzu. V'yafutzu means to scatter, but the word v'yafutzu, for those who know modern Hebrew, I mean, he uses the word mitpotzitzim umishtabrim haklipos. But the modern Hebrew that I'm referring to is the word for an explosive. It's called pitzatza. An explosion is pitzatza. Mefotzetz is to explode. So he says v'yafutzu, to scatter, v'yafutzu oivecha, that Hashem calls on Moshe calls on Hashem to redeem those sparks of holiness that are trapped within the klipot, and that there he's referring to the Vefutzu oivecha is the mashchit u'mechabel, the forces that seek a person's suffering, that bring a person to his own demise, even to death. So this is the oyev, and that's why it says vayhi lashon tsar, vayhi ben soah ha'aron, because the traveling of the Aron symbolizes the wanderings of the Jew in exile, and the experience of exile is very painful in a lot of ways. One of the ways is through persecution. So he says, so he calls on Hashem to explode and to remove the holiness from that trap, from the spark, from the husk, from the klipa, the shell. Then he says, V'yanusu misanecha, misanecha. It doesn't say V'yanusu sonecha, those who hate you, but V'yanusu misanecha, which has the same meaning, but it can equally mean those forces that cause a person to hate God. He says, Masniim derech Hashem belibos bnei Adam, that cause the path of Hashem to be hateful in the heart of a person. Someone who's an atheist, or someone who is a hostile, antagonistic to Torah, to religion, to religious observance. That force represents the Yetzer Hara, that is the force that causes a person to hate the way of Hashem. That's misanecha, the forces that cause man to hate you. So ve'enusu misanecha mipanecha. And that's why it says Lashon Rabim, ve'enusu misanecha in the plural, because the Yetzer Hara takes all different forms. A person can have a Yetzer Hara, can have a desire for illicit behavior in a lot of different realms, morally, and so many different realms. I don't think I need to enumerate them. So he says this is the meaning of that pasuk, and that's why, without saying so explicitly, that's why I think the Torah sets it off for those two inverse letters nun, because actually, although on the surface we don't see what's so important about it, according to this, it encapsulates, it describes the purpose of exile itself and the struggle that a person has to overcome those forces. And as just to review, he identifies the two aspects of the chitzonim, of those negative forces. One that seeks to bring a person down physically, practically, and cause him grief and harm and pain and sadness and despair. And the other that seeks to urge him and lure him to degeneracy and to behavior which takes him away from Hashem. The two aspects of the Yetzer Hara, of the Sitra Achra. Okay, we've got just a few minutes left, and I would like to look at one further passage, and this is in the following parak, chapter 11, verses 21 and 22. Now, you may not think of it this way, but I have always regarded this passage as one of the most difficult in the Torah. Difficult not to understand or to, translate, but difficult to explain how it could be that when the Jewish people are complaining and they don't like the manna from heaven, and they come to Moshe and they complain to Moshe, which they've done so many times as the Torah narrates, how can it be when the people say that they complain to Moshe? So that chapter begins, the subject matter begins, sorry. Actually, it begins at the beginning of chapter 11. I'm sorry, beginning of chapter 11, that the people started to complain, and that just lasts for a couple of verses. And then the people complained further in verse 4. They started to crave and to lust, and they began to cry. Everyone was crying, Mi yachilenu basar, where's the beef? Who will feed us meat? And they remember the fish that they had in Egypt, this strange nostalgia for the cordon bleu cuisine that they enjoyed in Egypt. But what's fascinating, and as I said, what to me is so problematic, is Moshe's reaction. How Moshe seems to question whether God is capable of addressing their needs. So take a look at verse 21, where Moshe says to Hashem, Moshe, verse 21, Sheish meos elef ragli ha'am asher anochi b'kirbo. There are 600,000 soldiers, men of fighting age. Asher anochi b'kirbo, and I am in their midst. Vata amarta basare tein lehem v'achlu chodesh yamim. And you said you're going to give them meat enough for 30 days. Moshe says, Hatzon uvakar yishachet lahem. If we slaughter the flock and the cattle, will it be sufficient for them? If you gather all the fish of the sea, will that be enough for them? Now, Moshe seems to be questioning whether God can provide. Hashem had said to Moshe, I will provide for them. I'm going to give them meat for days and days, even for a month. Moshe seems to question it. And so much so that the following verse in Pasuk Chaf Gimel, is God's hand insufficient? And Rashi, and I think all the Mefarshim, and I hope we as well, will have to wonder, Maholech Kan, how can it be? How can it be that Moshe, who is the faithful one, says, or ha-Hayyim, the way Moshe spoke wouldn't be appropriate for any person, any God-fearing individual, certainly of that generation, but even of any generation, to say to God, how can you provide for them? How can that be done? And Moshe Rabbeinu himself, it's so difficult to understand. I think this is one of the very difficult passages in the Torah. Or ha-Hayyim has a brilliant approach, and I want to say briefly only because our time is nearly up, so we'll be brief with it. He draws attention to the fact, if you look closely again at verse 21, Moshe says, V'ata amarta, Moshe quotes God's words, V'ata amarta basar etenem, I will give them meat. V'achlu chodesh yamim, enough to eat for 30 days. So, Or ha-Hayyim says, what's the necessity to mention again to this tzitut, this citation of that you had said, basar etein lahem? And also, when he says flock and cattle, actually they had flock and cattle. It wasn't that they were completely without those resources. When they left Egypt, the Torah says explicitly, they took livestock with them. And presumably, just as they survived, I'm not sure what the livestock ate, if they ate the man, possibly not, but the presumption is they still had livestock with them. So what's the big deal? Especially God can do anything. Says or ha-Hayyim. And also he says, why mention the fish? Who mentioned fish? It's true, the people originally said, yeah, we remember the fish we had in Egypt. But Hashem says, I'll give them meat. Don't worry, I'm going to give them meat for 30 days. Moshe said, how can you give them meat for 30 days? You can't do that, which is very strange. Says or ha-Hayyim, Moshe got to know the Jewish people quite well. Okay, God probably knew them better, but Moshe was still reporting from personal experience. He says, one menu option for these people is never going to be enough. You're going to give them meat, but there's all types of meat. Some like lamb, some like beef, some like venison, some like poultry, some like fish. Whatever you give them, there are going to be some people who say, yeah, but we don't want venison. We want beef. We don't want beef. We want lamb. We don't want lamb. We want fish. We don't want fish. We want venison. There'd be people who are going to complain whatever you provide. Fish, the ha-Hayyim, you gather all the fish in the sea, you're going to find that some people won't be happy. You're going to give them tuna, carp, salmon, snapper. There'll be someone who will say, yeah, but what about the lox? What about the gefilte fish? People are always going to find something that they don't have that they're going to complain about. Says Moshe, he understood Hashem when he said, etein basar, I'm going to give them meat. He thought one type of meat. So because Hashem was supposed to give them one type of meat, so regarding that, Moshe said one type of meat will never be enough for the people. So yes, you may slaughter the cattle that we have, but there'll be people who say, yeah, but we want poultry, but we want venison, we want other things. So Moshe essentially was saying to Hashem that if your policy is no complaints or you die, we're doomed, because the complaints is never there's no end to the complaints. And although it's probably true of human nature, it may be especially true of Jewish nature. And as I once heard from Rabbi Beryl Wine, one of the most ever recurring complaints is about the menu. We're always complaining about the menu. And so it is here as well. So according to ha-Hayyim, this is what the confusion is about, so to speak, that Moshe thought that Hashem's plan was to provide them meat, a certain type of meat, and Moshe said one type of meat is never going to suffice for them. And that's why he mentioned tzonu vakar, and he also mentioned the fish, and included in that, in the two kind of extreme options is also everything in between: venison, poultry, all types of duck and geese and mallard and chicken and other things. Quail, ultimately quail is what they had, of course. So that's how Or HaChaim explains it. And although that particular comment, is not the Kabbalistic type, and he himself says a number of drushes are found about this in the sages, but he said, what about the pshat? According to the pshat, we can understand it in the way that he has suggested. I wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and thank you as well to those who have extended their good wishes on the arrival of our first grandson in Britain. We have